Opala. Joseph A. Opala is an American historian noted for establishing the Gullah Connection, the historical links between the indigenous people of the West African nation of Sierra Leone and the Gullah people of the Low Country region of South Carolina and Georgia in the United States. Opala's historical research began with the study of Bunce Island, the British slave castle in Sierra Leone that was a departure point for many African slaves shipped to South Carolina and Georgia in the mid and late 18th century Middle Passage. He was the first scholar to recognize that Bunce Island has greater importance for the Gullah than any other West African slave castle. He ranks it as the most important historic site in Africa for the United States. Opala has traveled between Sierra Leone and the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country for 30 years, producing documentary films, museum exhibits, and popular publications on the historical connection. He is best known for a series of Gullah homecomings in which Gullah people traveled to Sierra Leone to explore their historical and family ties to that country. He has drawn on his original research to establish these connections and the work of earlier scholars, especially Lorenzo Dow Turner, an African-American linguist who in the 1930s and 40s traced many elements of Gullah speech to West African languages. Opala's research and public history events generated a national dialogue in Sierra Leone on the subject of family lost in the Atlantic slave trade. These discussions have continued for almost 3 decades. The Sierra Leone media first coined the phrase Gullah Connection for the family ties which Opala has brought to light. He helped generate a similar dialogue in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, where he has given public lectures and interviews to the local media and organized workshops for teachers and cultural activists for many years. His work has helped Gullahs recognize their links to African traditions. Opala's efforts to bring Sierra Leoneans and Gullahs together through an exploration of their common history have been recognized in both countries. In 2020, Sierra Leone's president, Ernest Bai Koroma, awarded Opala the Order of the Rochelle, the country's version of the British knighthood, and Sierra Leone citizenship the following year. Opala is now a dual citizen of the US and Sierra Leone. Penn Center, the oldest Gullah community organization in the United States, in 2013 inducted Opala into its prestigious 1862 Circle for his work in cultural preservation. So quite an impressive number of years spent studying both Africa and America and the ways in which the peoples that were taken from Africa and brought to America's lives were affected. So do you have your PowerPoint up, Mr. Opala?
I do, but do you know your voice is, yeah, it's got an enormous echo.
Okay, well, I'm gonna be quiet, so you won't hear my voice echoing anymore. And you'll just tell me, you'll just tell me when to.
But would everybody at the meeting is looking at these pictures?
Yes, everybody can see this,
Same
right?
pictures. Okay, I'm just wondering, because when I speak, I also have an echo. I suppose everybody will.
Oh, it sounds fine on my end.
Okay.
Does everybody else have an echo?
No.
Okay. So you can just tell me when to move the slide, Mr. Opala.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And I think someone just muted themselves. Maybe that was it. It just got really quiet.
Well, I see. But you're still.
Oh, I'm still echoing. Well, I'm going to be quiet. So, all right. So the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right. This is a lot of slides. So, especially since we're starting late, I was going to talk to the slides, but I think it might be better just to have them up there, and then yeah, anyway. Yeah, I think it'll just be clearer, and I might point to a particular slide. Wendy, can you see like in my computer they're numbered?
They're numbered for me as well.
Is there any, if you could see those numbers, then I could reference the numbers.
Okay. Okay.
But are they there?
Yes, they're numbered for me.
Okay, well, let's just start with the Sierra Leone map first. Start at the beginning, and I'll talk to that for just a little bit.
Okay, that's on display.
So what I'm really talking about here is a journey of discovery that I've been making over the last 40 years. I wound up going to Sierra Leone with the United States Peace Corps in 1974. And oddly enough, maybe appropriately enough, my job was to work with rice farmers. Sierra Leone is a part of what during the slave trade era, was called the Rice Coast. People have been growing rice there and in neighboring countries for thousands of years. And we know that the rice industry in colonial South Carolina and Georgia became aware very quickly that there was really no European body of knowledge on that very technical subject of rice culture. And that if their industry was going to succeed, they needed the knowledge that Africans from the Rice Coast brought with them. And so one of the differences between slavery and the slave trade in South Carolina and Georgia as compared to the other colonies was that if you look at the advertisements in the newspapers for Africans brought directly from Africa, in those two colonies and those two colonies only, those posters and advertisements referred to the geographical origins of the people who were taken there, and the rice planters were looking for the phrase rice coast or Sierra Leone or the Gambia or Senegambia, and sometimes also the Windward Coast. And very often, those posters would also contain sentences like, these Africans have considerable knowledge of rice farming from their own country. And so planters, rice planters, paid higher prices for Africans who came with those skills. Now, the first scholar to point that out was Peter Wood in his very important book, Black Majority, which is a history of African Americans in South Carolina. But the story is also very similar for coastal Georgia. When his book came out in '74, it caught the attention of every scholar of slavery, every scholar even of just the colonial era in North America, because he was the first person in to show that some Africans were brought because they could contribute huge body of technical knowledge that had been evolving on that rice coast of West Africa for not hundreds, but thousands of years. And once, the combination of the climate there in the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia, and you bring that together with what these Africans brought with them technically, and rice, we don't know this, but rice was the most lucrative industry in the North American colonies before the Revolutionary War. And it was a wonder to planters in other colonies. One of the things, of course, is that the Africans brought their knowledge, but their knowledge was so extensive that it created a different type of slavery in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country. Slavery is never anything but an atrocity, but the fact is, the Gullah's ancestors, the rice planters made concessions to them in a number of different regards. And and it was because they didn't want a confrontation with them, because it meant they would lose revenue. They just tried to create a situation in which which the Africans would produce rice in large quantities, which they did. You might ask, where was the market for that? The market, interestingly enough, was not in England. The British transshipped the rice to other places in Europe. But predominantly, it was two areas of Europe. It was in countries that had large standing armies. And rice can be preserved and kept if it's not kept properly and protected properly, it can last for many years. And it produces, of course, a huge bulk of carbohydrates, which is what a marching army needs. There was also a market for it in Southern Europe, especially Italy, but in the Catholic countries, because it was in that area, rice was their preferred diet during Lent. So there was a stable market for it in Europe, and large fortunes were made because of it. Now, needless to say, when I started off my research in 1977, 78, I didn't know this. And it was just, Peter Wood's book, oddly enough, was published in the U.S. The year I left for Peace Corps, which was 74. So I wouldn't know any of this stuff until I got back. So, as I said, I was sent to work with rice farmers in a small village called Bumbuna in Sierra Leone's northern province. And like farmers throughout that region, everyone was growing rice. I remember as well when I first arrived in the village, people would start telling me things, especially guys my own age. I was in my early 20s. But I remember a man came up to me and said, in a very confidential tone of voice, he said, you know, you're new here. You don't know much about us yet. But he said, let me tell you something. We're Sierra Leoneans, and we eat rice. We eat rice 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. And if we ever have to go to bed at night without having eaten rice, we feel terrible. We feel poverty-stricken. And I thought that was a kind of a cool insight. But then people kept coming up to me with the same speech. And I think I waited until maybe 10 times when I said, you can stop now because I've heard this before. But every time I said that, and this was a mystery too, they would say, really? Other people are telling you that? I have not been able to explain that. It's one thing to say we're rice eaters, but it was as if they'd memorized the text. And I'll just digress for a moment and say, when I first had the opportunity to visit Gullah country some years later, Emery Campbell, who's the Gullah's most famous community leader, he picked me up at the airport in Savannah and was driving me to his home on Hilton Head in South Carolina, where he was born and grew up and where his ancestors have lived for a very long time. We were about halfway there. He was driving, of course, and he looked over at me, and there was something in his facial expression and also the sort of confidential way he spoke. And he said, Joe, you're new here. You don't know our ways. But he said, let me tell you something. We're Gullahs. We eat rice 3 times a day. If we ever have to go to bed, I said, stop, Emery, just stop right there. He said, why? I said, I've heard the speech before. He said, where? I said, well, in Sierra Leone. So it's a statement of identity and pride in what they do. But it's also a part of, it's an Africanism. It's like so many other things the Gullahs have. It's a custom that their ancestors brought from Africa. I could say too, I mean, I stayed with his family, and the next morning they ushered me into the breakfast room, and they gave me some cornflakes, and I'm sitting there eating my cornflakes, and Emery's just sitting at the table, we're chatting, and a young woman came in, to show Emery her newborn baby. And he stood up and went over and sort of squeezed the baby's hand and was very complimentary of the baby. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. And he took out a dollar bill and he carefully folded it until it could fit in the baby's hand. And then he put the dollar in the baby's hand. I had seen that before. It is exactly what happened in that little village when the Peace Corps sent to me. So what happens there is that if a woman has a new baby, she'll take it to the chief, and Emery is nothing if not the chief of that area. And it's a way of announcing to the world, to the wider community, that this new person has come into existence. And they do the same thing. The elder will take money, paper money, and then sort of put it in the baby's hand. And that actually references the ancestors. So he now, as the appropriate living elder, it's implied then that he's at the top of the living hierarchy, but now he passes on to the ancestors, and it's assumed that the ancestors will pass it on to the Lord. I was just flabbergasted by seeing something so exactly the same on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. While I was there as well, and I'm trying to just give a sense now of what rice means to Gullah people, as well as Africans from the Rice Coast. It was Thanksgiving, and we were watching a football game in the living room, and there was going to be a big play, and you could see it developing. And suddenly, in the middle of all that, Emery stands up and walks into the kitchen. And so I mean, I wanted to see the play myself, but I was too curious as to what was going on. So I followed Emery into the kitchen, and he was standing at the stove with his wife, Emma, and he had taken over from her the role of actually preparing. Right. And I think he had a good calculation of when she was going to get to that stage. And I said, "What's happening? You're missing the big play." And he didn't say anything, but his wife turned to me and said, "He doesn't think I know how to cook the rice." And I said, "Well, where are you from? Are you not from here?" He said, "I'm from Mississippi." And Emery kind of blushed and turned to me and said, "Well, you know, rice is the most important part of the meal." So this thing goes back a long, long, long way. I could mention so many different things. Years later, I had the opportunity of living for 2 years on St. Helena Island, where Emery at that time was directing the famous Penn Center. But you know, living there in the community day by day for 2 years, there was so many things like that. That if you had lived in that part of Africa where rice is grown, you're going to see very, very similar customs all along. So that gives a bit of an idea of what I've been doing all these many years. But I'll just say at the moment that the connection is so strong and went on for so many generations that there is, I feel that work I do and work that other historians and anthropologists have done just scratches the surface. I have to say too, that while I brought back what I was learning to the Gullah community, I was also doing the same. I lived in Sierra Leone for 20 years, and there was an almost inexhaustible curiosity about the connection with the Gullahs on the Sierra Leone side. Most of the time I was there, I was teaching in the African Studies department at Fourbe College, which is the University of Sierra Leone. But and during the long period of time, if they wanted to interview me on the radio or TV, or people wanted me to give a talk in like a community organization, I would always do it. But I was always just astounded at how quickly that information disseminated through both communities, really. So people were really fascinated. On the African side, which of course is not just Sierra Leone, but the other rice-growing countries in the area, their point of view was, how do I put it, deeply personal, and very much rooted in their culture. They believe that, I think this is all over the continent, but they believe that they have to maintain a positive relationship with their ancestors. And it's different from the Western point of view, because their ancestors are still there. They don't go anywhere. And they are there in spirit. And every time an important development has happened, maybe some important person came into the village, was hosted by the chief, or maybe an opening of a new farm, building of a new like community center, that sort of thing. Every time that something important happens at the family level, at the community level, and even at the national level, they feel that it's necessary to inform the ancestors of what they're doing, because they say there's no luck in life, there's no prosperity in life, nothing goes well unless the ancestors are noticed, are kept very much involved in community affairs. But the ancestors also want to see, they want to see people be open and caring with one another, and they hate internal feuding, violence of any sort, or witchcraft, but they don't like ill will either. And they don't like hidden hatreds or animosities. And so knowing that the ancestors want these positive things, every ancestor ceremony always ends with, please try to help us have cool or cold hearts rather than hot. A hot heart means you're burning with antagonism. And so why is it so important for them, the Africans, to get the ancestors back, I should say? They know that thousands of their people in their area, I mean, Africa as a whole, of course, we're talking about millions, but they know they lost a lot of their ancestors. And they know they're over there somewhere, unless you're a historian or you don't know where they were taken. And also you don't know why they didn't come back. Because they knew about slavery, of course, but they wondered why people didn't manage to come back. Because, as one chief said to me once, we know that anyone who would have had the ability to come back would have come. But the fact is, some did come back. But if you tie that to ancestor veneration, you can understand why they're so anxious. They realize that thousands of their people just became spirits. They died, their spirit couldn't come home. And the idea of these spirits walking the earth, unable to come back into their ancestral soil, that's troublesome. And they don't talk about it much unless the subject comes up in a dramatic setting, like a homecoming. But so I guess in a way I had a very, very fascinating experience, because in the context of the homecomings, a lot of things come out and are said that aren't usually said. So when my Bunce Island work was got to be well publicized in Sierra Leone, and I taught local guides, for instance, to take people through. Starting with that, people just stopped me on the street. I was teaching at the college. They'll see me going to the market like everybody else, and just moving around town. And people I didn't know would stop me and ask me questions. And it was every level of society. It could be other college teachers like me, or high school or middle school teachers, but it could also be even very poor people. I can remember many times being approached like by a middle-aged lady on the street, and she had a pan, balanced on her head with fish. And so she was a fish dealer. But the questions people asked, whether they had formal education or not, whether they have lived a middle-class life or poor life, the questions were all the same. They kept asking about certain aspects of their culture. It wasn't everything that they were interested in, but they asked about certain things, like what rice dishes do they make? Talking about the Gullahs. They would ask that, for instance, and want to know how similar or different. And they wanted to know spiritual things as well. Do they venerate the ancestors in the same way? So that was an amazing experience to have people over a period of years approaching me that way. One lady, I'll never forget it, said to me, "I can't read, but my children are in school." And she said some of the articles that have appeared in the local newspapers on the Gullahs, I can't read them, but she said, I cut them out of the paper and I keep them for my children when they're old enough to be able to read them and get everything from them. People took it very, very personally. After a while, people started asking me, "Why don't you bring some of these Gullah people here to Sierra Leone?" I'm a teacher. They don't give me that kind of money. But and I get the sense that unless those people came home, or some of them, or maybe I could put it in a more positive way, they thought if some of those people could only come home, it would help to assuage the concerns of their ancestors that are still present. And they would regard that, the ancestors, they would regard that as a good deed and something that they themselves would appreciate, because they may be their own family members whose spirits are over there. So I was fortunate over there to be supported in the research I did. And I was 20 years in Sierra Leone altogether. We had 3 African American ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors in a row. And that's why I was able to get a number of these things done. And the first thing that happened, this happened because of we had a U.S. ambassador, Cynthia Shepard Perry, who was her professional life had been as a professor in historically black colleges, mostly in the South. and she saw actually the politics part of it. She kept pointing out to me that you in South Carolina and Georgia, you have up to 30% population or even more that are African Americans, and that they could be people in those states, black folks in those states, could wind up being a kind of ethnic lobby. And when Sierra Leone's civil war happened a few years later, that's precisely what happened. A lot of Gullah folks went to Washington and went door to door. I went with them a couple of times, and they would describe them to congressmen or senators, their congressmen and senators, as our family. So over the years I was involved in this, the first thing that happened, that was through Cynthia Perry, was a visit to Penn Center on St. Helena Island by the president of Sierra Leone. And I, was involved with that. And I actually traveled with the president and his entourage. But I went ahead of him. Well, I traveled with him as far as New York. He was giving a speech at the UN. But I went to Penn Center independently and worked with Emory Campbell and other members of the staff there to receive the president and his entourage. And boy, was that an experience. My book learning up to that time, my knowledge of this connection was book learning up until that time. So it was tremendous to be able to experience the culture. But what Emory and his staff asked for, what is there in our culture that would really strike the president and his people as something, well, they must be family. They've got to be, closely related. And of course, I knew some, but it was great to be in that kind of exploratory mode. First thing, the language. In Sierra Leone, there's a language called Creole, K-R-I-O. And Creole is a Creole language, C-R-E-O-L-E, not meaning there's any French influence, but Creole, to a linguist, means a hybridization of languages. So you're dealing with English contributing lots of the vocabulary, but the pronunciation comes from the sound systems of African languages. Both languages, African languages and English, also contribute grammar. And some of the African grammar is quite complicated. And it's amazing to see those structures in South Carolina and Georgia. So Mr. Campbell wanted to know, he says, I want to receive them in our Gullah language, but I want to say my greetings in a way that it's very so similar to Creole that they'll be able to understand. And he said to me, let's start out with how are you all doing this morning? And I would say it in Creole, and he'd write it down. But he doesn't know Creole. But he was writing it down because it was the same in Gullah. And he and everybody in the room was really at first shocked, and later were laughing because that task turned out to be actually quite simple. We were afraid it might be more difficult. When the president came to Penn Center, it was something to see up close, because he was experiencing this for the first time, as the Gullah people. Then what happened is, while the president was there, President Momo, he invited Emory Campbell to lead a homecoming trip back to Sierra Leone the following year. That would have been in '89. He came in '88 to Penn Center. And so the relationship was starting to build. And again, I had the wonderful opportunity of working with the Sierra Leone government and the U.S. Embassy. to help stage a number of events, sometimes ceremonies, that would show both sides. That the cultural and language connection was really, it was really strong. They came, the first Gullah group came, they just called it the Gullah Homecoming in November of '89. And I had not expected this. As much as I was involved in all this, I had no idea that it would be so powerful to Sierra Leoneans. I mean, all the Sierra Leoneans. For the week that they were there in Sierra Leone, they were the #1 lead in the news in all the media. And every single place we went, both in the capital city and then up country in the interior, they were mobbed. And some of them said, it's like I'm a movie star or something. I think Sierra Leoneans really believed that the people who came, the Gullahs, were somehow bringing the spirits of their ancestors back. And that really, really impacted me. The day that we were leaving to go up country to a village which was about to harvest its rice. And of course, they were anxious to see rice farming. And there'd be a lot of other cultural things we'd see. But we were, all of us in a bus, parked out in front of the U.S. Embassy in the center of the city. And we were about to leave when someone from the embassy came down, knocked on the door. The driver was basically just getting prepared to go. And he said, "Joe, you have to come. The ambassador has to see you." And I didn't want to leave them in that hot bus. So I ran into the embassy as fast as I could and went in. It turned out the ambassador wanted me to, they had given us some money to help organize these things. And before I left, he wanted to make sure that I signed everything. So, and of course that I would account for that money later on. I knew they had their paperwork, but still, it was a kind of uncomfortable moment. Anyway, when I finally did all that, I ran out the front door of the embassy, and I had a bird's eye view of what had happened around that bus in the 10 minutes I had been gone. People recognized the people as Gullah, the people they were seeing on TV and in the newspapers, and the bus was surrounded by hundreds of people. And I have to say, Sierra Leoneans are boisterous by nature. Their culture is very boisterous and life-affirming and filled with joy. And this wasn't that. I knew there would be moments when that joyous reception would be there, but that's not what I was seeing. I was actually sort of transfixed just looking at that bus. Now, I've been in Sierra Leone many years by then, so I had a pretty good idea of, but it still surprised me. The people who surrounding that bus were totally silent. They should have been yelling. That's what I would have expected. And there were so many of them, of the Sierra Leonean folks, that you had those that were sort of bellied up against the bus, and they had their hands up, trying to touch the people inside, just touch the people. And the second, there was like a second rank or behind them, the ones that they way in the back had no chance of touching anybody. But they reached at least in that direction. Again, I think they were feeling that they were somehow touching the spirits of their ancestors. I'd never seen anything like that before or since. And by the way, when we got to the rice fields, and it was about maybe 100 miles from the capital, the local chief was leading us down a trail to the last rice field that would be harvested. And we were lucky because November's a little bit late to be looking for harvesting rice, but we were fortunate. And when we got to the field, and you sort of, it went from, you can't see too much. There's vegetation on either side of the path. Suddenly it all opened up, and you saw hundreds of people out in those fields, joyously singing, dancing, and cutting the rice. And then that's their verb that they use, cutting the rice. And these were mainly middle-aged people, and school teachers. I mean, we even had a state senator from South Carolina. But the moment they saw that field, they ran out like children and joined with the harvesting of the rice. When we were on our way back to the Capitol later that day, in the bus I sat next to a lady who was a school teacher from Ladies Island, South Carolina, and I said to her, you look like a bunch of kids out there. What is it? What are you thinking when you just let loose like that? And she said something really interesting. She said when she was a child that when she was driving, especially anywhere around the island with her grandfather, that he would pass a certain place and point in that direction. Every time you passed it, he said that's where our ancestors, our family's ancestors, where they labored during slavery times, working on a rice field there. And she said, it never looked like anything to me because it was so overgrown. But she said, when I saw those people out there in that field, I realized that's what he was talking about. And it was just like I was seeing my own ancestors. And every one of the visitors returned home with a few sheaves, if that's the term, of the rice that they carefully prepared and rolled it in paper and so that it wouldn't get destroyed in their bags going back. So I guess that first visit, the Gullah homecoming, I want to tell you how it ended. That day, the president invited all the Gullah visitors, and I keep saying Gullah, but I'm sorry about that, because there were 3 Black Seminoles from Oklahoma, and of course I knew them, and I was so glad that it was possible for them to come, and so it wasn't. And I should also say that in the bus for like 6 days with those guys there, the Black Seminoles from Oklahoma, they were constantly comparing language and comparing customs with their Black Seminole relatives. It was the first time those communities had been in touch for a couple of hundred years. And I could see the mutual astonishment in finding so many different things in common. But when it came time for them to leave, that morning the president hosted them very informally at his home, had just, sandwiches and get some drinks, and he just sat with them in his living room, and people just talked about the experience. It was really like family. Then when it came time to go to the airport, that's the part I want to tell you. Somebody in government had written this huge, I guess, a farewell, and it was written largely, it was a banner essentially. And I remember it began with a statement, we, your Sierra Leonean family, wish you a safe and happy return to the United States. And then it went on to talk about what their presence there had meant to them. But I noticed very early, when I was just a Peace Corps, one of the cultural things that I noticed was they never sit on the ground, ever. If you're just out somewhere where there's no chair or you're out in nature, they'll find something, a piece of cardboard or something, maybe a bag, but they don't sit on the ground. And there's more to that than not wanting to dirty your clothing. It's it makes the distinction in part, that and other things, between living people and animals in the forest. So it's very important. And children are strictly trained from a very young age. If you don't have a chair, find a substitute, something to sit on. Right near that banner, I'm looking at maybe 10 cabinet members. These are very important people. And people who were like what we might call assistant secretary of this or that. So they were all very much elite. And it was a tremendous privilege to be saying goodbye to the Gullahs. But they were when I first saw them, they were standing on the runway. The plane had taken off. And all of them stood there looking into the sky. They did not move until the plane disappeared. And at that point, they all almost fell onto the ground. And they sat there on the ground, holding their heads and often their hands in front of their faces, and they cried like a child. I'd never seen anything like that. And it was sorrow. It was deeply felt sorrow. That Gullah homecoming, 1989, it fascinated everyone in the country. Everybody was reading their newspapers, listening to the radio, or watching TV if they were lucky enough to have one. And it was weeks. I have to say this, before they stopped congratulating me on having done this. I thought, well, that's good. It's worth all those years of work and frustration some of the time. And so people would stop me, like soldiers would stop me, and police or market women or whatever said, thank you for bringing. That lasted for about 2 weeks. And I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't stop. But sooner or later, people have to forget. But what happened is, almost on clockwork, about 2 weeks after the Gullahs had gone home, people would stop me in the street. And again, it's back to where Sierra Leoneans we eat rice. It was almost in the same words. They would always start out by saying, Mr. Opala, we're very disappointed. And I'm like, what are you disappointed about? Well, you remember Mr. Campbell? He was a really nice man, wasn't he? You see how tall he was? You ever seen anybody that tall in this country? And they said, he's a lovely man, and he's a wonderful representative for his Gullah, as they say, Gullah people. But he looks more like a Senegalese. So Senegalese are usually tall like that. And of course, they know that Senegalese are rice eaters too. There's every reason for a Senegalese descendant to be there. But he said that they would always say, we want you to bring people who, without a doubt, are the descendants of people from Sierra Leone. And I said, you can't do that. And I explained that, you could look, for instance, at a port like Charleston, look at their port records. You could actually determine the percentage of people who were enslaved and brought there who were from Sierra Leone, because the ships were all well documented. And that would give you an idea that there had to be many Sierra Leonean descendants in some places. Charleston, certainly one of it. Savannah is definitely another. But I said, people were not keeping that kind of information, and we just have to go on the basis of what was there. But nothing deterred them. And eventually, I realized they will badger me to death if I don't at least have some ideas on how that could be done. And over the next 10 years, I guess, I was able to work with them to do 2 more homecomings. But Jensen, this isn't tourism. This was in response to the specifics. They would say to me, "Can't you be more specific?" And my first thought ran to Lorenzo Turner, the famous African American linguist who published a very famous book called Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect, which came out in 1949. There have been 2 subsequent editions, by the way. It's still in print because it's a hugely important source on the Gullah and on African American history and culture in general. I'll just say this, and then I'll pause. I remember that on page 256 of Turner's book, he had there a song that he had collected in coastal Georgia from an elderly lady named Amelia Dawley. It was a 5-line song. And there are 2,000 languages in sub-Saharan Africa. And he had spent years. He was the first African American scholar, by the way, to become a specialist in African languages. And he traveled to Africa, traveled to the Caribbean, traveled to Brazil. He spent a lot of time in archives in Europe, where capitals like London or Brussels or so. These are places where records of the Atlantic slave trade or that country's participation in it are to be found today. But Turner spent 7 years, and he identified that song that he had found sung by this lady named Amelia Dawley, tiny little village in coastal Georgia. He identified it as Mende, which is the most widely spoken indigenous language in Sierra Leone. It was one of the reasons that we took them to rice farming situation in Mende country. It would be very typical of Sierra Leone and their food there. And I thought, well, this woman who sang her song in Mende for Turner, that was in 1933. She is definitely not with us anymore. But we may be able to identify other descendants if we could go, to where this family lived. And it turned out, by total coincidence, that one of the Gullah community leaders who came with Emery Campbell was from a town very close to that, to where Turner had recorded this woman back in 1933. And I didn't ask her, but she actually went to the county records and found a reference to Amelia Dawley. And from there, it wasn't difficult to trace her to her daughter, who's still alive, named Mary Moran, still living, by the way, in the same place where Turner had found them so many years ago. Well, that's a pretty direct connection. If and it turned out to be true that there is a daughter there. And of course, then the question was, would she remember that song? And it turned out she did. I nearly fainted when I realized it. And in fact, I didn't even want to play Turner's recording of that song. The original of it is in a music archive at Indiana University. And I had that recording, and I was going to play it for Mary, but I didn't want to play it until I could hear her version of it. And she was nice enough to agree to that. And it had hardly changed a bit. I think on literally a couple of vowels. It wasn't anything significant. It was actually tremendously helpful in doing our research that she had kept it so long. I don't know what your stamina is, but I'd like to leave it at that, and just take some questions or comments.
Okay. Well, yes, this has been amazing. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Opala?
Let me say this. I said leave it at that. What I meant is we can continue if you want.
Oh, okay.
But I
Well,
think that's a kind of a pause, good place to
yeah, this
pause.
is a good place to pause and just kind of see where everyone is at and if there are any questions that would spur on further conversation. And you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, or you can put the question in the chat if you'd like.
I have a question, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, so there's Creole, there's Gullah, there's ASC. How similar are those three?
They're really, really similar. And the first of all, I should say that Creole is so much a lingua franca in Sierra Leone that people from all the country's indigenous tribes, pretty much everybody knows Creole. Each tribe has its own accent, which can sometimes be amusing. But the language has grown and grown since independence in '61. It's become just the way it's the grease that keeps the country moving. You certainly need a lingua franca. So I loved it the moment I first heard it, and so during my volunteer years and afterwards, I gave a lot of time and attention to learning it grammatically, and I would later write the Peace Corps language manual for Creole, and for 6 years when I taught at Sierra Leone University of Sierra Leone, I actually taught a year-long course to linguistics students on the origin and development of the Creole language. And every time I would do that, like with linguistics students in a class, I would tell them about Gullah, and they thought it was interesting, but it wasn't until they heard it, there would be dead silence. We're lucky that there are about 100 stories, traditional stories in Gullah that were preserved by the right people at the right time. And so there's a lot of evidence. There's the language as it is today, but we also know a great deal about the language that was spoken even during the slavery era because of these. And I would read the songs that were the really authentic ones, the ones from that slavery era, to my class in Sierra Leone. And everybody just would stop. All these slack-jawed students, like, what? They didn't know whether they should believe it. That's how similar those. And I think the reason it's so close to Gullah is it's the language is going in back and forth in two directions. Lots of people from Sierra Leone were taken to the Gullah area. But then later on, a lot of Gullah folks were able in various and different ways to get themselves back to Sierra Leone. And so I think that's created this unusual closeness. Afro-Seminole Creole is interesting. It, in some ways, it's a conservative language because, the people who are speaking it, their ancestors were taken from Florida in the 1830s. So it's actually older than any evidence of Gullah that we have from South Carolina and Georgia. Any differences I shouldn't say any, some differences are clearly due to the fact that the Afro-Seminole is older. It has some African components that you don't find in modern Gullah, and you don't find it in the old stories. And that blew my mind when I read it in Ian's publications about some of these things. But it was another thing to have the opportunity to go there and actually hear it. There are some expressions in there. This is really interesting to me. Are in Creole, today's Creole, but not in Gullah. And that means that came directly from Africa. So it's fascinating. And there's those three languages in particular are extremely close. But also, Gullah and Afro-Seminole are also similar to some of the languages in the Caribbean. It's very similar, to, of course, to Bahamian, which a lot of the Bahamians' ancestors were Gullah people who were taken there and sold there during the Revolutionary War, usually by British officers, or during the Civil War. And so they are, in a sense, Gullahs themselves. I should say this too, just to show you. The last homecoming I worked on was called Priscilla's Homecoming. And in that case, it was a family whose history could be traced. I'm talking about a Gullah family in Charleston. Their history we could trace back to Sierra Leone with an unbroken paper trail of 250 years. Skip Gates, when he found out about it, he didn't believe it. But it is unbelievable. It's the only case we know. But in this case, we were able to dovetail slave ship records carried on the ship itself with slave sale records in Charleston, with plantation records of one particular rice-growing family, kept very much more detailed records of the enslaved people on their plantations than any other families that we've ever been able to find. And then, of course, after emancipation, then you have government records. But it's really unusual.
Mr. Opala, could you possibly give us an example of either some phrases or some words from each side of the Atlantic?
From each side of the Atlantic?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, yes, I'll say just something very simple one. During the Sierra Leone's awful civil war, somebody wrote a sign in Creole and hammered it up on the so-called cotton tree, which is a real symbol of the ancestors. It's right in the middle of Freetown, the capital city. And again, it goes back to the ancestors. People were saying this war wouldn't stop. It really was not a war. It was just an ongoing massacre. And they could, given that their worldview, it's obvious that they would make a connection. Why should such a horrible thing just go on like this? Senseless thing. And so what they wrote was, God vex panui. God vex panui. God's angry at us. And the equivalent in Gullah would be God bex panui. Instead of vex, they say bex.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Are there any other questions that anyone has?
You know, I could bring this up. When we were walking down that trail toward the rice farm, Emery Kim was walking behind me, and it started to rain. I mean, little sprinkles. And I heard him behind me say, "Rain to come." And that means rain is coming. And in Creole, it's the same. It's rain de come. In other words, they don't use rain as a verb as we do in English, raining. They don't have that. It's a noun. So rain's coming. Now, I know it's small, but when you consider that a lot of these similarities are found in scores or even hundreds of African languages, things that basic. And you know, when people were creating these Creole languages, on the plantations during the era of slavery, they would naturally favor certain grammatical elements that were most common to all of them. So that, you might have two people coming from, 1,000 miles away from each other, but both languages have some similar structures. And those similar structures you'll find often everywhere in the Caribbean basin. And, in West Africa, Creole is one of about 5 or 6 English-based Creoles that are found, and they're all remnants of the slave trade, really. I particularly like the word. Do you recognize this word, Bukra?
Yes.
It means white man, and you find it in Creole, most certainly in Gullah, and also in Afro-Seminole. At least maybe not currently, but
no, it is.
It's
used
there
in ASC.
And you also find it in Jamaican. But Ian made a discovery a few years ago, and he called me and told me. And he said, "You understand the importance of this?" I said, "Ian, you can't see me. I'm dancing." And what he found was an account of a sailor who gave testimony in a parliamentary community in London about certain aspects of the slave trade on the coast of West Africa. And he was talking about a conversation on that subject he had with a local king in the Sierra Leone. And so he quoted the king in what in those days was sometimes called the coastal jargon. The point is that we tend to think of Gullah, Jamaican, Afro-Seminole, whatever, as having grown indigenously here in the Americas. But the fact is, to facilitate that gigantic, monstrous slave trade, covering 4,000 miles of coastline and managing to put over 12 million people over a period of a few centuries on those ships, that situation is a kind of trading situation that would result in a Creole language that would be the language of trade. So when he found it at Montgomery Hancock in Sierra Leone, because it's not there, it is not in Creole, absolutely not. It goes to the point that he's made for many years, that if we look for the origins of these languages, then you have to consider that the root, the beginnings, are in West Africa. It's kind of counterintuitive, but on the other hand, what else? If they have a lingua franca for that period, this is what it's going to look like. Oh, I should say this too. I'm sorry about my life. A lot of these memories for me, are poignant and sad, but there was also a lot of fun in that mutual discovery, to watch that and to remember some of those moments when things were sort of came together for them. But in my own research, I had found Ian Hancock's articles about Gullah and about Creole in academic articles that he had published when he was a grad student in Europe. And fortunately, I found quite a few of them in the Sierra Leone Studies collection of the University of Sierra Leone in the library. And that just captured my imagination. By then I could speak Creole pretty well. the fact that that connection existed, it was just very, very fascinating to me. And when I got back to the United States, I called Ian Hancock. Now, this is 1979. And I was so excited by Hancock's articles. I'd had one lecture on the Gullah language as an undergraduate anthropology major at the University of Arizona. One lecture, and I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated by it. So I knew what Gullah meant, I mean, vaguely. I wanted to find this Hancock. But the first thing I did is I was told that another linguist, a Sierra Leone African linguist, who knew Hancock, he had been teaching at a university in Nigeria, and people told me he's come back. He's going to set up a department of African languages. And they said he didn't have a house yet, so he was staying in the Brookfields Hotel. So I went there. I met him. And I said, "Do you know Hancock?" He said, "No, Hancock. He's my best friend." They went to grad school together at School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And they did everything together. They edited an academic journal together. They just hung out with each other all the time. And he said, so he was my best friend. And I said, well, what do you think about this idea that he has, that there's something connecting Creole and Gullah? And he said, well, I'm totally in agreement. And later, I found his friend, by the way, was called A.K. Touré, or AKT. I became ultimately just a member of his family. And one night, during a big party, I was just wandering around the house, and I found a copy of Lorenzo Turner's book, Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect, and AKT's own copy from when he was a grad student. And I opened it up. He had notations in the margins of every single page. And most of them were where he was saying to Turner, basically, you don't include this word as being also in Temne. You've listed 3 African languages here. You don't mention Temne. And so, and there were hundreds of notes like that. Temne being the second most widely spoken language. But AKT gave me Ian's phone number. And so when I got back to the U.S., let me put it this way. I left Peace Corps. I had some money with me. I decided to go overland. You haven't lived till you've crossed the Sahara Desert. And but by the time I got back to the U.S., I was broke. I really wanted to go to the Gullah country. And so I had to call my dad and beg him to send me some money. And so I went directly to Oklahoma. So when I called Hancock, I told him I really think I want to do my master's or something on the Gullah language and maybe its connections to Creole. And he heard me out. And after a moment, he said, "Where'd you say you're calling from?" I said, "Oklahoma." And he said, "Well, you don't need to go to South Carolina and Georgia to study Gullah. It's right there in Oklahoma." And you know what? Funny. I realized that my plans of consulting with him or doing a thesis comparing Creole and Gullah, it was based on false premises. When he said it's in Oklahoma, I thought, this guy's crazy. So, and he read me right, too, even over the phone. I suddenly had no enthusiasm to continue that conversation just because of what he said. I know Oklahoma history pretty well. I was very much involved in historical research all through high school, and I worked every summer for the Oklahoma Historical Society. So I know that's not true. anyway, and he realized that I didn't have any faith in him at that point. And then in a kind of a fatherly voice, he said, look, I'm going to give you, go get a pencil, go to paper, and I'm going to give you reference to 2 books. It'll be in the University of Oklahoma Library. Read those books and call me back. If you don't read those books, don't call me back. And I couldn't believe what I was reading. And much of it, of course, on the Scouts and the connections there between them and the Gullahs. And then I started getting, actually, I actually tried to go into the Black Seminole, or they call it the Seminole Freedmen area. And I knew where they were located in that rural area. And I didn't have a plan, made any sense, but this was my plan. I'm going to drive into that area where they've been, I mean, ever since they moved there in the 1830s. I mean, there's a church there that's the oldest standing structure in the state of Oklahoma, because they got the black folks who came with the Seminoles got to Oklahoma before white people did. So I was really excited about doing it, but then I thought what I wanted was some proof that the language that Ian had experienced in Brackett might actually be in Oklahoma. So I bought a county map of Seminole County, and I had a contact with a local state senator from Seminole County, who had actually been a student of my dad's in law school. My dad taught law school at OU. And so my dad put me onto that senator. I drove there. I had a nice meeting with him. He was a white guy. But I said, do you know any of these Seminole freedmen? He said, well, yeah, we all went to the same high school. So yeah, I know some of them. But he said, I know there's a black guy here in town, meaning Seminole, the town of Seminole, who knows them better than I do. He's not one of them, but I noticed in high school he palled around with them a lot. And he said, I'll call him and tell him you're coming. So I went there to his house. He was nice. He was very open. And when I pulled my county map open, and I asked him, would you mind pointing out the area where they live? And he did. He showed it to me. But then, of course, when I had the chance now to look at that little tiny spot, I saw that there was a creek there named Cudjoe Creek, which is what they call a day name from what's now Ghana, the nation of. And I thought, oh, geez. So I folded the map and thanked him very much. And he said, well, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to go find those people. He said, no, you can't do that. I said, well, why not? He said, white people don't go there. So I said, what would happen if a white person did go there? And he said, we don't have the answer to that question because any white person ever went there never came back. Which I laughed at, of course. But I had an idea, a crazy idea. I spoke Creole from Sierra Leone pretty well. I didn't know Gullah. I had immersed myself in Turner's book, but reading a language and speaking it, in fact, I had relatively little idea of how it was pronounced by just having his book. So I thought the only thing I can do is I'll speak Creole. And if people look at me like I'm nuts, I'll know they don't have a context for that. But if maybe they pause, they don't say much, they're a little suspicious, I'll know at least that it might be worth coming back. So I made up my mind to look out for kids up to teenagers, because adults, of course, our opinions of things are a bit more settled and more conservative in our ways. So I was lucky. I'm driving down those dirt roads. It didn't take me long before I saw a bunch of kids. And the oldest looked like he was maybe 16 or something. And then there were younger ones down to maybe about 10. So I got out of the car and I didn't speak any English. I started speaking in Creole. And they didn't look alarmed. Like a crazy person. They just looked at me a bit suspiciously. But so I asked the oldest kid, I said, do people here speak that way? I mean, have you ever been around anybody who speaks that way? And he said, well, my grandpa does. And I said, can you give me an example? One of them was Hana Chilen go play. You know, in Creole, of course, that's a una pikin go play. And the Gullahs do say Hana in some areas. They say Una mostly, but they certainly would recognize Hana. And in Korea, it's Una. The difference being that in Gullah, it just means a pronoun meaning you, singular or plural. Whereas in Sierra Leone, Una is plural. It's when you're talking to a group. But this is all very, very similar. So I felt encouraged, and I continued driving down that road. Until I saw an elderly gentleman sitting on his porch, but his house was basically a log cabin. That house had been around a long time. And I pulled up and I introduced myself and I said I was a graduate student from the University of Oklahoma, and that I had spent some time in Africa, and I was really interested in the language that I understand that the freedmen, at least older folks, have. And he looked me over. He was quite elderly. He looked me over, and he sort of assessed me for a moment, deciding, you know, how he wanted to approach this. And he really got my attention. He said, "I hope you know that there were lynchings here in this area
something I guess maybe happens.
within living memory." And he said, "It really is not safe." He said, "Those memories don't die." And he said, "It's not safe for a white person to be in here." And he said it in such a sort of a fatherly way, and with I couldn't see it as a threat. There was no way to see that as a threat. He was actually just trying to help me stay out of trouble. And so I turned the car around and I didn't come back in. And wondering how I'm going to, because I was not going to stop until they really became clear to me that there's just no way. So I told my dad, of course, and he called another state senator from that area who had also been his student in law school, and who was also from Seminole County. He's a white guy, but he's from Seminole County. And he asked him if he knew anything about black folks in Seminole County where he grew up. That were associated with the Seminole Indians in some way. And he said he was on a first name basis. My dad was a judge. He was a state Supreme Court judge. But I noticed, even though the age difference and all that they were pretty intimate friends. He always called my dad by his first name. And he said, "Marion," he said, "I have a case which I'm representing the Seminole Freedmen community." And he said, "I don't know what your kid is studying at OU for his master's, but what I need is a historian." And he said, he called him Bill. He said, "Bill, where are you? Are you in Oklahoma City? Where are you?" He said, "Yeah, I can come to your office if you want." So my dad then called me, and he said, "Don't ask any questions. Just get in the car right this second and drive." And so I got to meet Bill Dawson, who was really, really tight with them, and he was doing all his work for them on a pro bono basis. And he explained to me why they needed a historian. and it was because the Seminole, the Indian Seminoles, the Seminole Nation, were in a big struggle, internal struggle. A federal court had awarded the Seminoles, this is in the 70s, $17 million for lands that they lost when they were, their treaties were violated and during the Seminole Wars. And now the problem became, what do you do with that? How do you divide it? Dividing it with the Seminole Indians in Florida was easy because you had a census, you knew how many people are in Oklahoma, how many people there. And so they're more numerous and they got the lion's share of that money, except that the 17 million had been in escrow for like 10 years. And it was lots of millions. And, but the problem was they couldn't distribute, in Oklahoma, because with Bill's help, the Seminole Freedmen community leaders were demanding that they have that money distributed to their community, also on just a basis of population. They didn't care about the money. It was very obvious they didn't care about but they insisted on having their own history acknowledged. And according to the Constitution of the Seminole Nation, which was adopted in 1866, the freedmen were official members of the tribe. In fact, they still had 6 representatives under their constitution who served in their tribal council. So Bill said, we need a historian, because they were maintaining, the Seminoles Indians, that the black folks were not involved in the defense of those lands that they're now being compensated for, which is bullshit, of course. Really, really bad bullshit. It's just historically off. So by that time, I had gone beyond the couple of books that existed on the Black Seminoles, and I was starting to dig into primary source records, which I was in the right university for it. And I just said, oh, hell yes, I would be happy to testify. And, but he said, what you know is one thing, whether they're going to be comfortable working with you is quite another. And he said, you're going to have to give him a talk, bring your slides, and about their history. He said, but don't talk about Africa. They don't know about Africa. That can come later. And he said, also he said, notice this. You'll see that the elder men are all sitting in front, and that the women, all elderly women, all sit behind. And he said, the women are the ones who are going to make the decision. It's not going to be the men. The men will say what the women tell them to say, but they're not going to really make the decisions as such. And he said, if you look at them closely, you'll see that throughout your talk, they're going to be giving glances back and forth. He said, don't get alarmed. That's just their decision-making process. So I gave my talk, and at Seminole Junior College, and all the Black Seminole leaders withdrew into a private room, and I'm sitting outside in the hallway. I felt like an expectant father at that moment. I was really quite nervous. So they called Bill in, and he came back out into the hall and sort of smacked me on the top of the head. And he said, you're in. And from that point on, I attended all their monthly meetings. And I was so fortunate because the word went out through their leadership that even if I brought cameras or local television or whatever, just let him do his thing. So I had an opportunity to either interview or to watch professional newsmen interview. And they were very sympathetic, and it resulted in a lot of things on local television. Everybody who talked to me about it said, I never knew those people existed. And so that was amazing plus people invited me to their homes for like a Sunday dinner. and I saw the food. This was amazing to me. They were eating rice with like a bed of greens on top of it, and or okra. And this is the Gullahs still have those things, and in Sierra Leone it's just like everyday food. I was so shocked when they put that in front of me. They thought I was turned off by the food. They said, we could make you some fried chicken, don't worry about it. I said, no, I'm just shocked. So that was an amazing experience to spend that time with them. Now, I mentioned earlier, you were asking about language, but this word, I brought up the word Bukra. I just want to say that when I was talking to that gentleman in Seminole, and he's the one who said to me, white people don't come out. I asked him, I said, your senator, he said, in high school, you hung out with those guys? He said, yeah. Well, he said, you got to understand, I'm not one of them, but I got along with them. And I said, you ever go home with a boy? Yeah, sometimes. I know that area. But this is the thing that really, of course, caught my attention. I said, have you ever heard them when they speak their language? And by the way, they have a name for that language, which I think Ian has said that is not used in Texas. They call it either flat or talking flat or flat talk. And that was their. So he said, I know one word. And I said, what's that? And he said, Bukra. He expected, of course, I wouldn't know it. I said, are you serious? Really? So I said, a white man, right? And I said, is it like neutral as a white guy, or is it insulting? He said, well, I think it's insulting. I think they say that if they're pissed off. But I mean, to have that word, I mean, that is in Gullah circles, that is the most famous Gullah word, Bukra. And white folks in South Carolina, Georgia, who live in those areas, they all know it. And then to have it here in rural Seminole County, Oklahoma. So you see why I was dancing when Ian said, that he had found proof of its use in Sierra Leone during the slave trade, during the 1700s. Shall I pause again? If there's any other?
Are there any other questions or anything?
Let me say this about rice.
Sure.
Bill Dawson, Senator Dawson, had told me, don't talk about Africa, but you can do that later if they trust you enough, and you get through this first hurdle. And so I did. So afterwards, they invited me to speak at Thomastown Church, and that's a big deal. As I say, it's the oldest standing structure in the state, but it's also kind of sacred to them. It's their oldest church community. One of the things I learned a number of things that day. And one was that, the Creek, the Seminole Indians were taken on removal, as you know, to the west into what became Oklahoma, starting, 1838, something like that. And as I say, they and the Indians got there ahead of white settlement, which didn't take place until 1889. And excuse me just a second, I would just organize my brain here for a moment. There were 5 civilized tribes, as they call them, and let's put civilized in quotations. Civilized tribe, most people don't realize it, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. Most people don't realize that these tribes were pretty highly acculturated, especially their leadership. Their leaders were English speakers. In some cases, their leaders were literally college graduates, and they're all from the South. So the elites of those tribes had plantations, they had slaves, and they're now coming west, bringing with them that Southern plantation and slavery culture. And when they saw the brotherly relationship between the Seminoles. The Seminoles are out there in the bush. That was, of course, one of the reasons they were so effective in their fight against the U.S. military. And they had never seen anything like that. And they were furious and they were threatened. Now, since the Seminole Indians and the Creeks or Muskogee folks, they spoke the same Indian language, Muskogee. They started the Creek leadership. They started putting pressure on the Seminole Indians to get these people under control. And there was a famous confrontation in what's now Wewoka, Oklahoma, part of Seminole County, where the Creek militia showed up on horseback, heavily armed, and tried to break up the settlement. But John Horse anticipated this, and he and his people were all equally well armed and made it very clear that they'd have to do a lot more than this to intimidate them. But they kind of realized at the same time that it was going to be hard going. One of the things I learned at that period when I spoke at Thomastown is that the so-called slaves, now called freedmen, that came west with the Creeks, the Black Creeks, most of them spoke Gullah, because they're just as the Seminoles just as the Seminoles' allies were Gullah speakers, is because of where they were coming from traditionally, which is close to the coast. And the same was true with the Creeks. And the Creek freedmen, as we call them now, had the same language and culture as the Seminole. In fact, I later learned, and you may know this, that some of the Creek freedmen, Black Creeks, actually joined their family in Nacimiento back in the 19th century. They just took off. And in that church, that Thomastown church, there were a number of Black Creek families that were members, and they were speaking the same Afro-Seminole Creole. I mean, it was disappearing beyond. I mean, people had memories of phrases. It wasn't like Texas, where it's lasted much longer. And I also learned that the sort of chief counselor for the Seminole chief of the whole Seminole Nation in the 1890s, early 1900s, was a Creek freedman who was also a lawyer, whose name was J. Coote Johnson. And when the Seminole chief and his sub-chiefs, when they went out to have discussions with U.S. government officials or military, Cootie went along with it because he spoke Seminole or Muskogee. It's the same language. So those two communities were there. Now, what else did I want to say about it? You may have wiped me out. The brain only lasts so long when you're 74 years old. Is there anything you might want to follow up on, or?
Something I wanted to mention earlier when you were talking about the connection between the Sierra Leoneans and the Gullahs. In December of 2022, Karina and I went to Beaufort, and we got there late, and we caught the tail end of the Gullah, I think it's called the Gullah Christmas Festival. It's a concert that's put on by Aunt Pearlie Sue. And that particular year, the ambassador, I think he was of Sierra Leone, was there.
Oh, the Sierra
And
Leone ambassador to the U.S.
yes, and we walked in as he was singing this song about Priscilla and saying that
Oh, you're talking about Charlie Hafner?
no, I think
No,
I don't remember what his name was, but he was
somebody was
from
singing a song about Priscilla.
yes.
Huh.
And I think I recorded a bit of it, but he said, you left in 15, I forget the date. Um, you left in 15, whatever the date was that she left, and we've been waiting for you. And now you are
Oh, that's new
home.
to me. Yeah.
It was a, yeah, and he sang it in English, but it was just, it silenced the crowd. It was just so beautiful the way he encapsulated it. And, you know, and you saying that there's always sort of this longing between the um, two, you know, coasts essentially. I I felt that, you know, and it just was very emotional in the room to realize that, you know, there's this longing for everybody to just be home, you know. So
You
I
know, there's also a song about the Black Seminoles that was
no.
composed by an artist in Sierra Leone and has
Oh,
been sung for quite a few years now. I need to get you in touch with him.
yeah, I
All the
had
homecomings we had, we involved a group called the Freetown Players, and especially their leader, Charlie Hafner. And so and his group composed songs for those homecomings, including the Black Seminole. I have to say that Sierra Leone took really, people took strongly to that story. The first lecture I ever gave, or public lecture at the United States Embassy on this history, was one of the people who came was the editor of one of the most well-respected newspapers in the capital, and he wrote an editorial the next day about it. And he said, and he ignored everything I said about the Gullahs, which is fine, because nobody else paid that much attention to the Black Seminoles. But he wrote in a very prominent editorial, he said, what we are now learning about the Black Seminole Gullahs, they often say Black Seminole Gullahs, is more valuable to us than the Star of Sierra Leone. And the Star of Sierra Leone was the largest gem diamond ever found in that country. It's the size of a golf ball. But I thought it was nicely said. People were very proud of that story. I had to kind of underplay it to some extent because the Gullah connection itself is so complicated. And but I don't think that anything one would say to them about the Black Devils would be anything but fascinating. And in fact, when we had that lunch the day that the first Gullah group was returning, Lawrence Cudjoe came forward and said, you know, they don't know who we are in Oklahoma. They haven't the slightest idea. They don't know about our history and our connections to Africa as well as to the Gullah people. And the president said, well, after this, meaning their homecoming to Sierra Leone, I think they're going to learn about you. Now, here's what I wanted to tell you about that Thomastown Church opportunity I had to speak with folks. So after the old ladies had sort of given me their blessing, that's when I got the invitation to come and talk to the church. And there were quite a few people there. And I was cognizant of the fact that I was cut loose now by the lawyer and I could talk about Africa. So the first thing I did is I put up a slide, and it was I had taken as a picture of a Sierra Leonean rice farmer in the field holding up these sheaves of rice. And if you ever attend a rice harvest in Sierra Leone, it is the happiest day of the year. And he had this just unmistakable joy written across his face. And they're looking at that, And they're looking at me, and they're looking at it. They had no context for that, which I knew, which is why I did it. I wanted something mysterious that would catch their attention. And I said one sentence. I said, your history really begins with rice. And there was a long pause. And then suddenly, everybody in the room, in the church, said the same thing at the same moment. They said, uh-huh. Because they're trying to put that together. And what it was is I asked some people later, look, the Seminole freedmen, they speak, they eat rice. The Seminole Indians, they eat rice. And that started, of course, way back in Florida. All the Indian agents who observed the Black Seminoles back then said that they're growing huge, gigantic fields of rice. And so they realized those things. And then, of course, they thought, but white people here don't eat rice. And even African Americans who've come in here, they don't eat rice. So that's how they process it. And it went from there. I remember having dinner with some Seminole freedmen. They were all at odds with the Indians. And one of them said to me, we were all having rice. And he said, when you have rice and hominy at the same meal, you're in trouble. And it was just a way of using foods to describe the conflict, although they all readily agreed that the Seminole Indians eat rice there just as much as they do. As I say, if you look at those early accounts, especially the Indian agents who came into the Florida after the first Seminole War, just to observe, every single one of them talks about gigantic fields of rice that the black folks were growing. And I mentioned this, recently as well. When they wound up in 1838 on the Arkansas River, what's now eastern Oklahoma, at Fort Gibson, the Indian agents were there as well. Federal agents were watching their remove, and one of those accounts, a long time ago, of course, is the Indian agents either in Oklahoma or what would become Oklahoma. And the first day they were there, they took out some rice seed they'd carefully preserved along the way, and they tried to grow rice in Oklahoma. It's not going to work. But it sure says something about what was on their minds. And I noticed something else. Having the opportunity to go around and give lectures at universities all around the country, you learn things by people's responses. And almost every place I've been, a black person, I'm talking about, Indiana, I'm thinking in particular, one particular incident. But most places I go, African Americans will come up and say to me, my family eats rice. And when I was a kid, I noticed none of the other black families, they were eating potatoes. We were eating rice. And one of the things that has occurred to me, that of course is an echo of history. And the last thing that you lose of that culture that is the eating of rice itself. It made me think too about the fact that modern plant geneticists have given a lot of attention trying to figure out where and when rice first appeared in Africa. And right now, the best, most accepted date is that they started experimenting, especially along the Niger River, but also some other rivers. They began experimenting with rice using a local species that's related to Asian varieties, but it's not the same species, same genus, but not the same species. And that started around 2500 BC. That's a long time. But I mean, it occurs to me, and I've been to the Niger River, by the way. It's a thing unto itself because it flows. The water, the rain starts producing lots of water in the head. What do they call it? The headland of the river. But because of the shape of the land, instead of flowing toward the sea, as you see in South Carolina and Georgia, the Niger, which is the biggest river in the region, it actually flows northeast into the Sahara Desert. And early European explorers assumed that it just went into the desert and evaporated. But in fact, what it does, it following the land, at a place called the Great Bend of the Niger, it gradually makes a bend and then goes far south and flows out into the ocean in what's now Nigeria. But it took a while before people figured that out. But that's a huge amount of territory where you can grow all kinds of plants, even though it's desert conditions, along the part of the margins of the river where you have some shallow water and where the ground gets inundated every year in season. And that's where Africans first noticed the precursor of their African rice. And that's where they were doing their experiments. It just occurs to me that all starts, that whole complex of Africans and their rice starts there. It goes on to the coast of West Africa, again, following the river systems. And then, of course, with the Gullah story, you see it getting spread to South Carolina and Georgia. And then later on, if people couldn't grow it, they certainly ate it. I had a conversation with Dub Warrior and Ethel when we brought them and Ian Hancock to Penn Center during the period I was there, during Heritage Day, so that we could talk about the Black Seminole connections to it, and to really, really good audiences that are there to learn in various ways. And it occurred to me that we're talking like almost 5,000 years, and what you're seeing in places like Indiana is sort of that's the ending point of it. And you lose the eating of it, well, you've really moved on. But that defines, for me at least, an important migration pattern. It's part of overall American history. And if you think about the resistance the Black Seminoles put up in Florida, it's like nothing else. And you look at what the commanding general, General Jessup, Thomas Sidney Jessup, what he wrote back to the War Department and to Congress. He said, "Gentlemen, be assured, this is not an Indian. This is a Negro and not an Indian war." And he made it very clear that those Seminoles were not going to move as long as the blacks weren't going to move. They recognized that they had more to lose than they did, but they also, recognized that they were the backbone of their military resistance. Abraham's name among the Seminoles meant essentially Suanafe Tastanagi, which basically means a field marshal, the highest of all generals. Rice was an important part of that resistance. Rice is empowering if you know how to grow it, and you could even conceal large rice fields in wilderness areas where if you're clever about it, your enemies won't find it, and they'll use that as a backstop. So if the army reaches this point to where our village is now, they're going to find we burned everything up and we poisoned the wells, and we ain't anywhere and we burned our rice, and we're nowhere to be seen. But they were all laughing and enjoying themselves 30 miles into the wilderness with a perfectly decent rice crop. So it's very much connected with their history and their ability to resist. And I remember even like talking this was back in the 90s. I was doing some interviews in Riceboro, Georgia. I talked to an elder man who, it was great because he would talk, he had grown rice during the Depression when there was no wage labor to be had. And he said he kept his family alive with it, kept his parents alive and his own family as well. And he was clearly very, very proud of that. And it was also interesting for me to interview him because he had no English for that experience. But he was telling me about, making the mortar and pestle and the fanner basket and all the various things that they did in the swamp. And this I've seen and done all that because I was a rice volunteer. But he could only describe that in Gullah. And I learned I had to keep my eyes down because if we made eye contact, he would get self-aware and start slow down or trying to say it in English, and it didn't come naturally. So I kept my eyes on my paper. But it felt so real. I mean, it felt just like conversations I'd had with the farmers I was working with in Sierra Leone. But that pride is unmistakable. And the thing is, rice really is technical. And you almost need to adapt it to every little micro environment that you want to grow it in. And during those thousands of years that Africans were developing rice cultivation, they had an enormous challenge. It was one thing to grow it in the interior in those mud flats around the Niger River, but when they followed the rivers to the coast, the coastal area that they used to call the rice coast in the slave trade days, that is almost certainly the most ecologically and climatology-wise, the most diverse land on the planet, because you've got in the north the Sahara Desert, and as you move south toward the equator, you have a whole spectrum of climate zones, and you go through. From there, you go into the savanna, grassland areas. South of there, you have savanna and some mixed forest here and there. Later on, you're getting into rainforest, real rainforest. And over thousands of years, Africans developed all kinds of rice varieties, but also all kinds of different ways to alter the land itself. So in each case, they brought with them the ability to change the rice. And we're talking thousands of years ago, they worked this stuff out. They have the ability to change the rice, but they also have the ability to change the landscape in ways that the rice also finds more tolerable. So for instance, in some areas, they were able to reclaim estuary land, which is mucky and saturated with water, but also has enormous nutrients because all that's coming down off the land up above. And they actually found ways of desalinating that estuary land. If you could only, and also I should let me say this, and they also developed varieties of salt-resistant rice to go in it. They could change the landscape and change the rice. This is some pretty highly scientific stuff. And so one geographer who's quite a famous geographer at Berkeley, who's done research in Africa on this stuff, she says, and I totally believe her, she said that there are more different types of rice cultivation in that 700 miles of rice coast in West Africa than in the whole of East Asia. Damn. And that's what these people brought. So when the slave ships were cruising up and down the rice coast, the people they brought in, enslaved people that they purchased and brought in, collectively, they had all that knowledge, all different kinds of rice cultivation. So who the hell else would be able to go just to any place they took you to and be able to develop a powerfully rich industry like that? I mean, their amount of technical knowledge was just unprecedented. essentially any place you took them, as long as it was warm enough, they'll figure out a way to plant rice and to cultivate rice there. And I guess this last little impression, let me end with it. When they invited me to Thomastown Church, I couldn't attend the service because I was too wound up thinking of what I'm going to say to these folks. So I noticed there was a little tobacco farm on the other side of the road. And I walked over there. You know, if you've done archaeology as long as I have, you can't take your eyes off any kind of open ground. It just comes naturally after a while. And I was drawn to it because between the tobacco plants, there was a lot of earth that had been plowed up, but the plant was small enough that it wasn't digging into that. And you know what I found? I found a U.S. military button that is Civil War era. I thought it was when I looked at it, and then I later looked at the books. How poignant is that? What had happened is the Black Seminoles that migrated down into Coahuila. There were those who didn't leave Indian Territory. They stayed. And due to the influence of the Creeks and the other 5 civilized tribes leadership, they were enslaved essentially. But when the Civil War came, they ran off and joined the U.S. Army in a unit in Kansas. And they were part of a big battle called Honey Springs. It was one of the biggest battles out west, in which they decisively defeated the Confederates. So wonderful history, wonderful heritage. You know, if you ask what I would like to see in the future, I would like to see it understood that was not an Indian war down there. Those were not Indian wars. And those were wars of liberation on an African frontier. You see, at that period, Black Seminoles. Let me say this first. Florida was a weird thing, a very unusual thing, by the late 1600s, early 1700s. It was a vast, open land with very little human habitation. Smallpox that Europeans brought from up north gradually made its way down there. Yellow fever and malaria had come from Africa itself via the slave trade in the Caribbean, came from the other direction. And those diseases and raids by South Carolina and Georgia colonists had essentially destroyed the entire native population of Florida. People have been there for many thousands of years. They're gone. And so the only people at that period who could make a go of that kind of land in that tropical or semi-tropical environment, West African rice farmers or gullahs. So here the gullahs, having been brought over there in South Carolina and Georgia for some very sophisticated kind of industry, there was an opportunity for them. And they knew very well, they didn't have to be told, that if they could get into those lands, tropical lands far to the south, that they're going to prosper. So you can follow this story by looking at rice. But for some reason, it's also interesting. Rice stays the same all the way through. But you've also got a Creole language that stays all the way to Nacimiento. And although, there are only remnants of it now, that's what they came with. They came with the Creole language, and they came with their rice farming abilities. I think it changes American history. I don't think if you add a war of liberation on an African frontier with the notion that the Seminoles never did surrender, and then the way they battled off the U.S. military for a very long time. And then their heroic actions, first in defending their homes in Mexico, and then later serving the U.S. cavalry, with 4 of them winning the Medal of Honor. This is a unique story. And what it shows, it shows that where Africans could find a place like home, like Africa, the skills and knowledge they brought with them, they were actually unconquerable. It gives a whole new view of U.S. history. That's what I'd really like to see most come out of all this, is that awareness. I'm imagining a whole group of people who I put to sleep.
No, you haven't.
No, you haven't, Mr. Opala. I could take things in a bunch of different directions, and I don't want to bore Wendy, but maybe the time will come when we can get together over a coffee or beer, because there's some nuances that you didn't bring up that I'm aware of, but we could exchange. I'd like to exchange notes with you at some point.
Is it
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Yeah, can I share your email address with him?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, it's right in front of you, kiheki@yahoo.com. That's it.
Okay.
You know, when you talk about the removals in the 5 civilized tribes, and I've said this before, not enough, you did imply it, but not enough credit is given to those that fought on behalf of the Union. Although those factions, for the most part, in terms of our full-blood relatives, for the most part, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But if we look at what happened back in the Southeast prior to removal, there was social upheaval among those, the progressive, which I call the perversives, by the way, you can quote me, that's my humble opinion, versus the traditionalists. The traditionalists often didn't want to have anything to do with the way the progressives were taking their societies, because they were the ones that starting to mimic white Southern culture in particular. And ironically enough, they're the ones later, even though we got run out of the homelands, they're the ones that would sign the treaties with the Confederate States of America. But again, we can explore this some other time. I don't want to put everybody else to sleep. I've done that back in August. So
Yeah, you got to leave some stuff out. You know,
I understand this,
I left out the Negro Fort, which is an extraordinary story,
yes.
and
Goodness,
closely related to the Black Seminole. What a story that is.
Well, now that you mentioned that, let me just bring up that we're going to be focusing on the Negro Fort in January at the Loxahatchee River Battlefield in Jupiter, Florida, when we do our annual Seminole Maroon Remembrance Martin Luther King weekend, January 19th specifically, and we're going to be focusing on the Negro Fort. So we do invite everyone to come to that event for that weekend.
Yes.
That's such an important subject.
Jupiter, Florida.
Okay, good. Yeah, I did just see the flyer for that. So it's January 19th, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Since no one else is talking, I'd like to ask you a question about the Moran family. Are you in touch with the Moran family, Mr. Opala?
Right.
You mentioned the Moran family. Can you tell us something about them currently?
Well, Mary passed away, fairly recently. Wilson and his family have been made a number of different subsequent trips to Sierra Leone and helped to advance the interests of that village, Senungola, where we first encountered Bendu. They at one point they built a little pharmacy and they repaired the school, and I think they repaired a church there as well. So they become part of that community, very much so.
Thank you.
And Wilson gives talks, speeches, and frequently, and I gather that tourists are even starting to go there. When we were on Amadou Massali's trip a couple of years ago, BBC reporters from Britain were following his progress during that particular trip. So that story has grown, and there's somebody wrote I guess you'd call it, I don't know what you call it. It's not an opera as such, but a musical, I guess, musical. Somebody based the plot of a musical partly on the Moran story. And that thing was performed at theaters everywhere from Massachusetts to California.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's one of those icons of African American history and culture that just, it's going to be there forever.
Can you tell me the name of that production?
I wish I could. But I'd be able to. Okay, let me give you my email address.
Okay.
And I'll look it up for you.
Okay. I'm ready.
But my email is easy. It's just josephopala@gmail.com.
Oh,
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
Now Herb Fraser. I don't know if you met him, the Gullah man journalist from Charleston. He's published now several books on the Gullahs, and he is writing a book on that story. I think he wants to call it. I hope the publisher lets him do it. He wants to call it "Crossing the Sea on a Sacred Song."
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been an amazing presentation. So
I'm so glad we didn't use those pictures.
well, I did kind of go through them slowly as you were talking.
Yeah.
Just to
you probably recognize what's going on in most of them now.
Yeah. I saw the way that you had structured your talk. Yeah, so if there are no more questions or anything, if anyone wants to contact Mr. Opala, his email address is josephopala@gmail.com. That is the best way to contact you, right? So just send you an email and you'll respond, right?
Yeah, but you have my phone number as well.
Yes. And I can send out, let me see, I don't have it in front of me. Oh no, his phone number is the number under his name. So that's his phone number there.
So it's 540-908-0906.
Yes.
I'm laughing? I'm laughing because I get two echoes when I speak. And the first echo, I don't recognize as my own voice. So a couple of times I've apologized to myself for cutting into somebody else's.
I heard you say that, or you would pause for a second. So, well, I just want to say thank you for coming on tonight and all the preparation that you put into the presentation before. I know that you worked, really hard and wanted to do an amazing presentation. So, and I knew you wouldn't disappoint. So I just want to say thank you, for, just wanting to give a presentation that everybody would benefit from. And I think that did happen. So
have you guys seen, by the way, the language you cry in?
I did put that in the chat, and I think it's available on YouTube if anyone wants to.
Well, it's not, maybe.
Oh, no.
The first video I did was Family Across the Sea. That's certainly worth seeing. But the language you cry in is currently being streamed.
Yes,
online.
You're right. Yeah. It is.
That's the Moran story, and it's a better film, frankly, than than the first one. Although I mean, they're both very educational.
Yes, we have it on CD.
Okay. Yeah, I did see the streaming for The Language You Cry In. So I can send that link to everybody if I find it, so you can access it.
I'm grateful to you, big guys, because my memory is not as bad as I feared it might be.
No, your memory is amazing. No, nothing to
No,
worry
believe me,
about.
I cruised over some stuff that I'd forgotten, but it wasn't as bad as I feared.
No, not at all.
If I could say so, you're representing us old timers pretty good, Mr. Opala.
Say again?
I said you're representing us old timers very well, if I can say so in my humble opinion.
Oh, well, thank you.
I'm glad I remembered to say that.
All right, everyone. Well, I just want to say thank you for another great presentation. And you all have Mr. Opala's email address. So if you have any questions for him, you can connect with him there. And again, just thank you. And everyone have a great evening.
You're welcome.
The same. Have a good one.
All right, y'all too. And this will be, this was recorded, so this will be on YouTube. I'll probably try to get it tomorrow. And I'll send the link out if anybody, wants the link, it'll be on YouTube.
Cool.
All right, thank you.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
Just while folks are still on the line. So one of you asked me how similar Gullah was to Creole. I just want to say the first time I cracked the book with stories in authentic 19th century Gullah language. I mean, I had seen Ian, his articles, and other linguists, they'll make comparisons, but to actually see a whole text. And by then I'd been speaking Creole for at least 15 years or something. I opened it up, and I swear I heard the speaker's voice in my head, because it's the same grammar. I even anticipated he's going to shift the past tense here. I mean, I literally could anticipate words in a language I'd never seen written before or heard being spoken. That's how close they are.
Makes sense.
And can I just say this one fun thing, since this is just to make the moment maybe slightly more lighthearted. I have to tell you this story. You know, the government in Sierra Leone made me a citizen. That's a big, big deal to me. So anyway, now when I arrive at the airport with my African Sierra Leone passport, I always get in the local line to go and, get my passport checked and all that. But I'm obviously the only white person in the line. And everything's in English. I mean, there's signs pointing people where to go. So the people around me look nervous. Oh, this poor guy, he probably doesn't speak English. And, they're kind of embarrassed for me, I guess. And whenever they snatch a glance at me, I always try to look dumb, like Forrest Gump kind of look. Like, I don't know what's going on. And inevitably, a customs official will come up, tap me on the shoulder, and point to the other line. And this is what people had feared, I think. They're really hospitable. They don't want to see anybody embarrassed. So I continue with my Forrest Gump look. And then just at the right, I pick my moment, my comedic moment. And then in Creole, I say, with a bit of exasperation in my voice, well, what is it about me that makes you think I'm not from here? And at that point, everybody starts laughing. Wendy?
Yes,
Is
I'm
everybody
here.
gone?
No, everyone's here. I think everyone's just quiet. So,
Well, folks, thanks very much. I had a lot of fun.
we did too. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Yes, everyone have a great night.
Yeah, have a good one. Nia Ni. Peace.
Thank you, Wendy.
Oh, thank you, Dr. T. And we'll be seeing you soon.
Oh,
Great
thank
week,
you.
everyone.
Okay. Okay.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.